Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Kevin. I'll chat a bit today about the Colorado. Is everyone here in the master's course? Raise your hand if you're in the master's course. Is anybody not in the master's course? Okay, we do have some non. Saskia, yeah. Hi, how are you? Yeah, so I'm going to yammer on about the Colorado River today a little bit, and then tomorrow in the master's course we'll talk about the Nile. I did this master's back in 2012, and then hung around for probably too long. But yeah, so I'm very familiar with this world here, and I give lots of talks on these topics before. But a lot has happened in the last days on these rivers. So yeah, things are constantly evolving. So hopefully we've got some new interesting stuff. But we have just an hour here. And if we don't finish in an hour, then you have to go to the pub and ask me questions after that. That's obligatory. No, it's not obligatory. You don't have to go to the pub. Okay. So Colorado River, and you guys had a talk, or some people had a talk from CAP recently, some from the Central Arizona Project. They've got to have a great perspective because they're the ones standing on the edge of that cliff, about to fall over if they're not careful. I'm stepping back a little bit and tell you about the whole process. Okay, so I'm going to give an overview of the Colorado Basin. Hopefully this is not going to be too repetitive of stuff. Talk about the law of the river, some pertinent elements of it, the negotiation process that's underway right now, some of the key points, and then how decision making under deep uncertainty is being integrated and to what extent it's being used. Okay, here's our geography. We're in a geography environment. So western United States, the river flows from the mountains, Colorado, where I'm from, and Wyoming, flows out through, follows the line, ends up in the Gulf of California, and I'll step through this. So alpine to desert to sea, crossing two countries, Mexico down at the bottom here, the last like, so 20 kilometers or 20 miles, I forgot. Is at the very end, so and then 7 states in the US, 2 states in Mexico contribute to the area there. One Sonora hardly does. Lots of agriculture, 40 million people, including little cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, minor things like that. 30 recognized tribes right now, wildlife refuges, national parks. They may be staffed, who knows? Trump reference. I'll try not to make any Trump references throughout this, just to hide my opinions. Okay, 4 major zones here. We talk about the upper basin, talk about the Grand Canyon in the middle, the lower river, and the delta. Those are the 4 kind of big areas here. Upper basin, relatively natural flows up there, some reservoirs, but pretty natural flows up there. Great fishing, good environmental conditions, lots of agriculture up there. I mean, small scale agriculture in comparison, but beautiful area. I like it. The Grand Canyon, that's the big majestic areas you think of about Colorado. Who's from the U.S. here? Anybody been to the Grand Canyon?
I'm from
Yes. You're from where?
Phoenix.
You're from Phoenix. Okay. Grand Canyon, phenomenal place. I like canyonlands back. I always tell people if you go to the U.S., go to Utah. It's a pretty crazy state. There's no place in the world like Utah. Just amazing canyons. I mean, this Grand Canyon sits on the border. It has Lake Powell with the Glen Canyon Dam at the top. It has Hoover Dam at the bottom, and it kind of runs like a ditch between the two because it's highly engineered between those 2 big, massive reservoirs. So Hoover Dam, Lake Powell, big engineering wonders of the engineered world. So what has it done? It's really flattened that hydrology. Here's the variation of hydrology before that. When Lake Mead was put in, or the Hoover Dam, really flattened things down, and then after Lake Powell was put in, it flooded a little bit once, but then pretty much is just very engineered going through the ditch, a little ditch. Below Lake Mead is the river just gets dewatered continuously. Water gets pulled out to go to these major the biggest irrigation districts in California and Arizona. Water just gets pulled out all along the way, and eventually when it gets down to the border, Mexico does get water. A lot of people say that U.S. takes all the water. That's not true. Mexico gets about 10% of the water. But that border really shows you, so there's the U.S. and Mexico. Just before it crosses the border is some of the largest diversions called the All-American Canal. And right below that is the Morelos Canal. that pulls water into Mexico. So pretty much all the water gets dewatered by the time it hits Mexico or gets right across the border. And then, so if you look at the flows coming into that last dam, here's where it all gets diverted, the last bit into Mexico, and the rest is just kind of a little trickle. Then you get some irrigation return flows, nasty saline flows, but not a whole lot makes it to the sea. We use this crazy unit called acre feet, or million acre feet, and that is an irrigation depth of 1 acre, so it's roughly 1.25 billion cubic meters. So I'll use the word acre feet a lot. It just rolls off my tongue now, so I won't try to convert it to anything else. People ask me all the time, is there a policy for the Colorado River? The answer is not really. It's got a lot of pieces to it. And so we call it the law of the river. It's a whole compilation of different things that guide the operation of the river. Starting in 1922, we're going to step through a couple of these things. So 1922 Colorado River Compact. Here's the text, blah, 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 blah. If you were to blow that up, you would see it says, the biggest thing it did is apportion the upper and lower basin states. Drew a line kind of in the middle, an area called Lee's Ferry, and said the upper basin will get 7.5 and the lower basin will get 7.5 million acre feet of rights. But then it also said the upper states will not cause the flow to be depleted below an aggregate of 75 million acre feet over any 10 years. So that's kind of the way they dealt with variability. They said, okay, well, they each get the right, but the upper basin will make sure the lower basin and not cause. So this should raise some alarm flags. When you think about climate change, can you blame the upper basin for causing these reductions? So, okay, so that's the biggest thing it did. It also said, at that point, 1922, there wasn't an agreement with Mexico. And so, but they did reckon, the U.S. recognized that Mexico needs some water, deserves some water. They hadn't agreed how, so they said, well, when it comes down to it, they'll share equally between the upper and lower basin. Sort of a simplified thing. So all the things in yellow is kind of what I'm highlighting here. So that was in 1922. We'll jump ahead to 1944, where the U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty. So what else was going on? And why did people ask me a lot in denial of, well, why did U.S. give Mexico water? Why didn't they just keep it all for themselves? Well, we also didn't want a very angry neighbor with us that would buddy up with the Soviet Union. So the geopolitics was playing into that pretty seriously. There was a lot of influence of the Soviet Union in Latin America, and we really didn't want a Soviet-aligned country to be to south of the border. So big things going on then. 1944. And that basically, it was a treaty that used both specified the waters with the Colorado and the Rio Grande, another river called the Tijuana. But it basically guaranteed 1.5 million acre feet would make it to the border, would cross the border every year. That is the #1 priority of the U.S. Mexico always gets their water, always, 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 unless they agree to reduce it down. So that notion that America is always screwing over Mexico, it's not really accurate. You kind of see that in the news a lot, but they have the #1 priority, and they guard that priority very carefully, and the U.S. always delivers that. Only in the event of an extraordinary drought would they reduce that by the same proportion is what they agreed on. But they've never defined what an extraordinary drought is. We've tried to define that, but it's a very political thing to do. So in this, we'll kind of talk about that. Okay, so the major allocation agreements that exist. 1922 compact, divided up between the upper and lower basin, like I said. It said 7.5 for each of them, so 15 million acre feet there. I said it won't cause the flow to go below 75 million acre feet across the border there. And then the 44 treaty gave Mexico 1.5. There, so a total of 16.5 million acre feet is allocated for usage. Well, they're not quite using that much yet. How much they're actually using? Well, the upper basin is only using about 4 million acre feet. Lower basin is using their full 7.5. And they divide that very carefully between California, Arizona, and Nevada, those 3 lower basin states. Mexico uses their 1.5, and there's this darn pesky thing called reservoir evaporation. They didn't quite fully take into account on it. So the total amount of water that's being used is roughly 15.4 million acre feet. That's how much water generally, more or less. How much water is there? 15.4 million acre feet. There's a nice little sloping line we see. This is the flow at Leaf Ferry, which is kind of in the middle. There's a few small inflows at the bottom. But for all intents and purposes, we're going to say this is the amount of water available. Well, the average annual flow is about 14.6 million acre feet going back to 1906, which is a number that's definitely less than that number. These treaties came about during this pluvial period when flows were really high. So it was like 17.4 million acre feet. And there's a lot of evidence that there's some people that really thought that there was less water available, but they agreed to these allocations because it makes agreements a lot easier if you just pretend like there's more water than there is. Millennium Drought more recently, since 2000, about 12.4 million acre feet, so way lower than how much is currently being used. So it's a problem. So we've seen this coming through time. Here's the average annual inflows or supplies, average annual water usage across the entire basin. So remember the numbers a little bit. But just about 2000 or so, those lines were crossed. And it really was in CAP, Central Arizona Project, started using all of their water. They weren't using all of it, and they were basically all using it then. And we said, okay, there's major issues. We're hitting the edge of the cliff now. And the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that's in charge of managing water, they're the water master, they had to figure out kind of what to do with this. So here's what the reservoirs have been doing. This is the storage of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, flying high in the 1980s. Right about 2000, it was looking pretty good. 1998, 93% full, and crashed down to 24% full in a very short period of time. Those reservoirs started going down quickly. So we see things like this. Reservoir levels dropping, little tiny boats with big bathtub ring around the reservoirs. So this massive area or massive lifeline for the arid western U.S. and northwestern Mexico is drying out. Why is this? Okay, you think it's due to drought, due to overconsumption, due to climate change? Good philosophical questions. Who would say drought? Does this cause a drought? Overconsumption? Climate change? Probably all of the above, of course. Some kind of mix, but it's really hard to parse these things out. I would say overconsumption, sure as heck, is one of the things. We can see that. Drought, we're definitely in a low period, and is that drought being exacerbated by climate change? Probably, likely. Yeah, I mean, aridification, general temperatures being higher, more evaporation off the landscape. We're generally seeing drier. It's hard to say. It could get wet again. A lot of the climate models say it could get super wet again, but most things are saying drier. Okay, how have water managers responded to this? We'll give a little foreshadowing. So Upper Basin says, we're only using 4 million acre feet. We're not going to reduce our uses. Are you crazy? We're not even using all of our rights. So the burden has really been on the Lower Basin, including CAP, and Mexico. So they've been reducing that amount, 7.5, 1.5. The maximum they would ever reduce if things got really bad was about 1.375. So we could say that at least 1.4 or 14.2 million acre feet is still made available. Well, that still is quite a bigger number than 12.4. So it basically says these measures that they've come up with are not sufficient. Okay, so getting that a little bit more. So 2000 guidelines and coordinated operations. So a big environmental impact assessment to say who's going to get cut back, how are they going to do it, how do they get to that number. So the questions asked is what constitutes a shortage, drought/shortage, and what should the lower basin states do about it, and how should the upper basin states contribute or participate, or how should their reservoir, as I think it is, be releasing water downstream. So those are the two big questions that were on the table in this big EIS. So you can imagine this. This is a reservoir, Lake Mead. Water comes into it from upstream, Grand Canyon. Some water gets out. If you go to Las Vegas, horrible place to go, unless you really like casinos and stuff like that, which I don't. Pump water out directly into the city that shouldn't exist. Even though they're the most efficient city, like when you talk about those that are really pushing the science forward, Las Vegas, they're the ones that are really doing the good things. They know they're kind of the idiots, like using too much water, so they're really good about implementing programs for reducing grass usage, evapotranspiration, etc. So I bag on them, but they're my friends too. So the reservoir, so water gets pumped out to Nevada, releases go downstream to California, Arizona, Mexico, and what this agreement did basically is said, okay, well, let's put elevations and let's call sort of normal conditions, some surplus conditions, some shortage conditions, so really tie the elevations of the reservoir, or tie the shortage declarations to the elevations of the reservoir, and they come up with the different elevation numbers on there and how much water gets is allowed to be used. So 7.5 is if it's normal, then you use less and less as they go down. Mexico, they're not part of this agreement right now, so they just still get their 1.5. So this is kind of what they came up with during the first negotiation. How do they say that the reservoirs should be? So before the upper reservoir would kind of contribute the 7.5 foot lower, plus sort of divide half of what they would owe for Mexico. Kind of very simple calculation. But they said, okay, we're going to wipe that out. And after lots of negotiations, they ended up like putting sort of bans on things too. Sort of this, and we're not going to go into detail about this, but it's basically, they came up with this very intricate, okay, if the reservoirs are really full, they're going to equalize the two reservoirs, balance the volumes between them. If it's in this next tier, they're going to release certain amounts of water. If the other reservoirs is very low, though, they're going to balance water again, but then they're going to give, so you get a whole bunch of like kind of numbers. How did they get to these things? This is not science. This is really negotiation. This is horse trading, back and forth and back and forth. So they try to interject some science in there, but the negotiations are really where these numbers came out, and these are the law of land right now. So just complex, ugly, drag out, knock down fights to get these numbers to figure out how these massive reservoirs will be operating. Okay, a few other things it did, created this idea of an intentionally created surplus. So for the first time, it allowed those lower basin states to bank water so that they could save water and put it in the reservoir, not use it 1 year, store it, and then they could use it later on. So they could either do conserve water, efficiency improvements, desal projects, something like that, that have very strict rules on when they could draw it out. If the reservoirs get too low, you don't want everybody drawing their water out at the same time during a drought, because then everything crashes, and the run on the bank idea. And they also said they didn't want transfers to go, they don't want California to come up with a whole bunch of money and give Arizona a bunch of money and take all their water. So Arizona hates the idea of interbasin transfers, which is changing now. So that was just some of the innovations that happened, 2007. Okay, Mexico wasn't involved in this. 2012, really the USA-Mexico treaty. So the states agreed to this, US states agreed to this with the promise that the federal government said, we will bring Mexico to the table on this. They'll be part of this, of this sharing the pain. And Mexico's sitting back going, we don't really want to reduce our amount. But you better give us something good if we're going to reduce our water. But they want to avoid that notion of trying to declare an extraordinary drought, because we don't know what that's going to be. They don't want the U.S. to declare. They want that sort of formally decided and carefully reduced. So an earthquake happened in 2010, and that was this window of opportunity. And this earthquake did damage to Mexico's delivery system. And so the U.S. Said, we can help you with that. Their canals can't deliver their full 1.5 million acre feet. They can't use all that water, so you can store it in our reservoirs upstream and take it when you want. And so a very short agreement was put into place very quickly that would help Mexico out, that would open up this dialogue to getting maybe some solutions on the table. And so a policy window of so minute 318 basically opened up this opportunity to store water in there. It really helped out Mexico through this kind of crisis time while they could rebuild their canals, and really open up this dialogue to be able to see how Mexico could participate or share in this in droughts. So minute 319, I was really involved in this whole process. Won't go into the details of it. Basically, they agreed that Mexico would share in shortage and surplus based on elevation triggers that matched the U.S., everything in proportion, really. Mexico could store a bunch of water in Lake Mead, a whole bunch of saline issues to deal with, and then the environmental groups were a key piece of this. The delta at the very end was dry, and so the NGOs, brilliant NGOs, were really working kind of on both sides of the border to make sure that Mexico wanted the environment to be part of the negotiations. And they stayed firm that they wanted some kind of delta restoration to be part of the deal. And that really made things happen. The NGOs were amazing with this. And U.S. contributed funds. Mexico followed some lands. Nonprofits got together and got a bunch of, you can see Raise the River is one of the projects that funded money for this, but got the opportunity to have a base flow and a pulse flow for the Delta. So it's really the first time that the water actually made it to the sea in a long time, since the 1980s. So it was just a test thing. We were hoping this would go for a while, but really got sort of a 6-year deal, and then it had to be extended after that. But that was a great step forward. Okay. Well, that wasn't enough. All those things were not enough. The reservoirs kept on crashing. And so in 2017, 2019, further efforts, they basically said all these agreements are not doing enough to save the system. We need more. So the reservoirs are still going down. So these additional measures were extending the minute 319 to minute 323. Increase the volume that Mexico would reduce in tandem with how much the U.S. would agree to reduce with their drought contingency plan. Mexico was being smart, and they said, "We will agree as soon as you guys get your act together and reduce your water. We will reduce a proportion." So U.S. Mexico signed this thing before the states actually agreed to how to reduce stuff. So very good relationships with Mexico. A little anecdote on this: we were very stressed about. During minute 319 process, and later on, I wasn't part of 323, but during minute 319, that was a time when Obama was up for re-election. We were building good relationships with Mexico, and there was definitely this political pressure. We got to get something in place before you might get, say, a president that sort of wants to build walls and do things like that. And we're to really sour that relationship, because these treaties, we realize, are actually stronger than any administration. Like the treaties are, we're hoping that Trump doesn't try to trash this, but really take advantage of these good relationship times to build bridges before you get walls being built through this. So everyone hold our breath for the next 4 years and see what happens. Okay, so all of these things expire in 2026. All these agreements to reduce the amount of water expire next year, and there is not an agreement on how to do it next. So here's the edge of the cliff. So this is what Reclamation says. So they will address the challenges since the 2007 interim guidelines. They recognize that the last 20 years since the Millennium Drought have been some of the worst years in the geologic record, or in the hydrologic record, or the paleo record, sorry. Reservoirs declining, links with climate change, is high levels of variability, so we're not really sure exactly what the future has, but has to be taken into account. Evolving stakeholder engagement. People like me want to get very involved in the process, and a lot of parties want to get involved. So they need to increase their amount of information transfer with stakeholders. And using this method, decision making under deep uncertainty, as a technical framework for developing the alternatives. And one of the methods of doing this was starting a new tool. We'll say the post 2026 operations exploration tool. So a web tool that would allow stakeholders to really engage in the process and come up with ideas. So stakeholder engagement. Okay, so here's some of the key questions they're asking through this process. What hydrologic conditions should be considered? More than they have been, maybe. How much should the basin reduce as a whole? Their total usage be reduced? And how should those shortages be distributed amongst users, both between the states and between individual users? How should they do it? How should Lake Mead and Lake Powell be coordinated? The same question they had before, but sort of increased urgency. what proactive conservation strategies might be invoked to can we come up with some new ideas that can help? So that ICS, that banking was sort of one idea, but we'll expand on that. And then how should the tribes be considered in this process? Those 30 tribes wield a lot of potential power. They use very little water, but they have a lot of so for the whole notion of prior appropriations is how the water in the western United States is run on. So first in time, first in right. Those who use the water first have senior rights. At one point the tribes are like, hey, wait a minute, we've been here for a long time. And so there's been a long process of quantifying the amount of water that the tribes could get. And they have, most of them, they still have some that they're negotiating, but most of that water is, I mean, there's large volumes of water the tribes are using, or it could use, they're not using. But could that be, how could that be factored in the process? They basically were not part of the previous processes. 1922, they weren't even part of the discussion, even though they said they would respect the tribal rights at some point. 2007, they were invited in, but they really did not participate in. They were just not, they were not, they weren't, they were not fully brought into the process. Now the federal government is fully trying to bring the tribes into the process. Okay, so what hydrologic conditions should be considered? Well, this notion of decision-making under deep uncertainty starts out with this idea of statistics. We don't really know what the future is going to hold. So we don't want to hang our hats on any one particular statistical distribution. So I'm going to focus on covering a wide range of possible futures. As wide as we can think of is sort of plausible or realistic. We don't exactly know what the next year is going to be, so we need to start the reservoirs at different levels, run our analysis. And then a lot of the presentation is sort of the number of traces that meet or do not meet some conditions. It's almost kind of a binary or percentage. Not statistical, but kind of looks statistical sometimes. So what they do, so they've selected 400 traces or hydrologic scenarios from a whole bunch of different methods. 33 based on sort of historical chunks of time, a bunch downscaled from CMET 5 hydrology climate change scenarios, some resampling from historical paleo droughts from back in the 1200s, where they used tree cores. A whole bunch of different methods basically to try to get a wide variety of different possible hydrologic features. How much should be reduced overall, and how should those be distributed? Well, biggest question still, the biggest question they're still trying to hammer out today, and we're trying to help them with this, is how should these shortages be distributed to the upper and lower basin? Again, the upper basin says, we're not even using all our water, we can use more. My home state of Colorado. And the lower basin says, our economy is just completely dependent on this water, don't cut us back too far. And Mexico's like, when you guys agree, we'll talk. Prior appropriations versus pro rata. So some of the reductions, this is some of the hot topics. Do you reduce people based on the priority system, or do you, the people that are using more water should reduce more water? And it should be pro rata, percentage of whatever people are using. Of course, the senior water users are saying, no, we are senior. The tribes are saying, we are senior, don't touch our water, this is ours. But the biggest irrigation districts, the Imperial Irrigation District in California, is also saying, no, we have very senior rights. You cut off Central Arizona project before you cut us off. Or do you do it by states? So, or some kind of combination, blah, blah, blah. So that's the challenges of how you decide who gets cut back. Big decisions. Okay, so one study we did kind of contribute to this. We were basically looking at the question of if the upper basin were to limit their development that sort of stabilize the system if the Millennium Drought were to continue on. And so we kind of came up with some numbers. Then Reclamation also had their own analyses, but the overall consensus right now is Lower Basin has to reduce their uses by about 1.5 million acre feet just to get rid of the structural deficit. Right now, the Lower Basin, they're releasing more water, or they're releasing less water than the Lower Basin uses. If the reservoir is going to keep crashing unless something happens with that with the Lower Basin. So 1.5 million acre feet is sort of the notion of a structural deficit. Furthermore, 2 to 4 million acre feet is kind of the target of how much water should be reduced. This is up to a quarter of the amount of water that's being used right now. Huge amounts to reduce. Massive amounts of water to reduce. Who's going to take those kind of reductions? If you have good answers, let me know, because we're still looking. And on the allocation, senior rights are very reluctant to give up any concessions. In the end, in theory, it used to be, a land of laws. And so they're saying, no, we follow the law. And CAP, last time, was probably saying, yep, we will follow the law, but please, can you guys help out? Okay, how should Lake Mead and Lake Powell be coordinated? That's another hot topic that we're constantly exploring. How much water should be, basically it's the question, how do you balance the storage between the two reservoirs? How much water should be kept in Lake Powell versus Lake Mead? What are the implications on the Grand Canyon? Again, the Grand Canyon's kind of been treated like a ditch. Can we be a little bit more protective of the ecosystems that are in there and the hydropower issues and blah, blah, blah. And big question is whether a compact call, remember that 75 million acre feet over 10 years? If the lower basin says, hey, the flows have fallen below a certain level, upper basin, you need to cut off your water to get water downstream. It's called a compact call. And that'll send a big pulse of make Lake Powell release a lot more water downstream. So go back to our little schematic of our coordinated reservoirs over there. So one thought is, some of these proposals are equalize reservoirs always. Just keep those two reservoirs nice and happily balanced in between, more or less. Or the idea of fill one reservoir first. Fill Mead first has been sort of one option. Do we let Lake Powell just fill up secondary? Do we just concentrate all that water into one reservoir and let the other reservoir fill up? And a lot of environmental groups are saying we should just get rid of Lake Powell. We should let the river flow again. It's a great rafting area, fun. While the water supply says, I don't know, we kind of may need that water someday if it fills back up again. So, but that's one idea. We've been looking at fill Mead Powell versus fill Mead first versus fill Powell first. Do you maintain Powell full? So if you can maintain Powell very full, and this is one of the National Park Service really wants to keep the elevations of that reservoir higher because it makes colder water, releases, helps some of the habitat downstream, plus it avoids any of the invasive species that sit in the upper reservoir to get dumped into Lake Powell, the smallmouth bass, which just go to town on the invasive on the endangered species. There's 4 endangered species in the river. So from one environmental perspective, we're saying, well, we want to keep Powell really, really full, and the other environmental perspective says we should eliminate Powell completely. And so a lot of times environmental groups cannot get on the same page of what they want. They really need to. It would help out a lot. But if you eliminated Powell, they'd say, well, maybe you could drill the bypass. So one of the challenges, all the sediment gets trapped up at the top. And so even if they make big environmental flood-like releases, well, the sediment doesn't go through and just kind of gets scoured through the Grand Canyon. Naturally, should have a lot of sediment. That's where a lot of habitat is. We're building beaches on the sides, and one idea is okay, we should either get rid of Powell or we should modify its engineering so we can pass that sediment a lot easier, like it'd be more natural. So lots of discussions on how to do this. We don't have any solid answers yet. Working on it. But somehow, Lake Powell releases will be somehow a function of how much water is sitting in the reservoir, possibly what hydrology, the lower basin shortages, or how much water lower basin everyone would reduce. There's a combination of how much water is sitting in the system, possibly how much water is the recent hydrologies. So the next thing is what other sort of measures or proactive solutions can we think of to try to deal with some of this madness? So many of the alternatives are looking at expanding that notion of banking. allowing water users, maybe not just the states, but maybe letting individual water users or tribes bank their water and either use it for their own future use or sell it to other water users. Be able to market that. So of course now the tribes are saying this is, okay, maybe we can, yeah. But of course one of the challenges, well, we'll get the tribes in a second. Or one of the other ideas is the federal government purchases, if the federal government wants to purchase anything anymore, water to prop up the system, because the reservoirs got so low it came close to losing hydropower of the massive reservoirs. Could the federal government purchase a lot of water, kind of like they did in Australia in some ways? Put a big buffer of padding back in the reservoirs again, and that's for infrastructure protection, better environmental management. And then here's the brain teaser question is, should the banked water be considered when you're deciding how much to short the basin? So if you remember before I said the shortages depend on the volume of water. If you bank a bunch of water, how things have currently been operated is that banked water sort of helps avoid shortage because now the reservoirs are higher, elevations are higher. We say, there's no shortage because we banked a bunch of water. On the other hand, we're thinking these should maybe be operationally neutral storage and say, don't consider that part of the system. Let's remove that banked water from the system, declare your shortages, and then decide if you want to use your banked water to make up the shortages. So what's happened currently is certain players have learned to kind of game the system a little bit. Okay, let's just get the reservoirs a little bit higher so there's not a shortage declared, and then so they've been kind of kicking the can down the road by including that banked water in. So the big notion right now is to do operational neutral for any of the shortages. So it's a new mechanism exploring who can participate, what are the rules and regulations for participating in this. We're trying to think out of the box to get around these issues. And a lot of people say, hey, these are just moving shells around. You need some structural changes of cut people back in big ways, which is probably true as well. But that's painful to do. Okay, and then the last piece of this is how should tribal concerns be incorporated? I've insinuated this. Collectively, the tribes own probably about 25% of the total water in the system. A lot of water if they're able to leverage their full water rights. A lot of water. Vastly underutilized. The juniors are benefiting from the fact that that those senior rights are not being used. And the question is, should tribes be able to bank their unused water? So the deal right now is you can trade your water if you're using your water. But if you're not using your water, you can't trade your water. So what this tells the tribes is, well, go build a bunch of bogus projects that kind of use your water so you can come up with a reason to trade it. That's ridiculous. Can we just cut to the chase and say, tribes, you can have some of your water, put it in the bank, and then sell it or give it to the federal government to prop up? Do we need to make the tribes build projects just so they can trade it? Or can we actually let them use the water that they legally own? So it's a big paradigm shift. I'm trying to get now. Disclaimer, I work for NGOs, I work for tribes, I work for CAP, and I work for the federal government all at the same time. So what are some of the technical methods by which to approach this from Reclamation's point of view? So they want to combine, so we get to the technical nerdy stuff here. So combining some modeling with search algorithms to be able to identify possible solutions. Evaluate lots of possible solutions based on acceptability criteria or robustness criteria. Here we're going to get into the decision making under deep uncertainty. And then create this sort of web-based platform that allows stakeholders to design and test their own policies to kind of open up the conversation space. Okay, so these things called multi-objective evolutionary algorithms. So it's taking a model, and we'll talk a little more about models tomorrow, but if you guys have had any chance to play with these things, so some type of a river system model, and then you're coupling that with these multi-objective evolutionary algorithms, which are little machine learning toys. And basically the idea is once you build a model that simulates the system, you're passing in certain decision variables, or levers we'll say, into the model. Then the model is going to come back with some results And the results are kind of your objectives. We want to keep Lake Powell above this level. We want to keep Lake Mead above this level. We want to, this is the shortest water users. We want to minimize, or we want to maximize that or minimize that or whatever. We have a bunch of criteria. So these objectives come out of the model, and this algorithm, this Borg, it says, okay, well, let's try some different ideas and throw it back to the model. And then it just does this thing over and over and over and over again and starts searching for different solutions. And say, okay, well, maybe this is better, maybe this is better, maybe this is better. And it develops a set of non-dominated solutions as it plucks through this decision space. What does that mean? Okay, so if you've got a bunch of, so here's just two different trade-offs. So maybe it's trying to keep Lake Mead below, or the frequency of Lake Mead falls below 1,000. We want that to be as low as possible, and the total shortage volume want to be as low as possible. These two things are going to be at odds with each other. Those are trade-offs. So then this modeling, this board starts looking at a whole bunch of different possible options. If we just have these little two scenarios, and we see a bunch of solutions on this decision space. But then we notice that some of these solutions dominate the other solutions. They're better in both dimensions than these ones over there. So this C dominates everything in this box. So you'd never want to pick a solution that sat in this box because you've got something that's better in both dimensions there. So this is called a Pareto front. And then we're talking about multi-objective Pareto fronts. So then you kind of take all these ones on the boundary there. These are your non-dominated solutions. Throw away all the other ones. Then you're really just negotiating with a subset of possible options. So. This is from a master's student. Alexander had a list of different possible objectives. Really, the states are going to define what these are in the end. Then you can build these, called them parallel plots, which are basically, here's all your different objectives that you might have. And then down is sort of a good thing. And then if you map all of those different potential options, you kind of say, okay, well, here is one option through here, and then you put on a bunch of other options through there. So you kind of get a range, and the closer you are to the bottom, so there's a way to compare each of those different possible alternatives across each of the different objectives. Where we see crosses, that really represents the trade-off between the two different objectives. So that's basically what you're doing. You're trying a whole bunch of different options. You're putting out a menu of different ideas for the policymakers to noodle over and say, these are the ones that sort of technically make sense. Now y'all can argue over, negotiate over which ones actually you want to use. So that's kind of this decision making under deep and sort of this multi-objective process. Key concepts for DMDU: acceptability, robustness, and vulnerability. So acceptability, a future that is considered acceptable if some performance goal is met with some frequency of time. Robustness, the percent of acceptable futures. I just have to read this to remember. And vulnerability, you're trying to identify which conditions put the system into a vulnerable state. Okay, so acceptability, these are some, so imagine a couple different hydrologic scenarios, and we don't want the reservoir to get below this dotted line. And if we have the blue scenario, it stays above the dotted line, so it's staying above there 100% of the time. We say, okay, that's an acceptable hydrology. This policy, whatever policy generated this, works under that hydrologic condition. However, in this hydrologic condition, it's not acceptable because it fell under this thing at least one time. So that would be considered a non-acceptable outcome. So then we throw a whole bunch of different hydrologies at this, and we start saying, well, how many times do we have acceptable versus unacceptable outcomes? So that's a robustness. A robustness score of 48.5%, or if we had 400 times 3 initial conditions, 1,200 starting conditions, or 1,200 different alternatives, or 1,200 different hydrologic scenarios. 48.5% of them pass this specific criteria. So that's sort of the robustness of this particular policy to that particular criteria. And then they characterize things in terms of the vulnerability. So each of the different, when they look at this, they say, okay, well, what hydrologic conditions are causing each of these things to happen? They're trying to identify what is the under what hydrologic conditions are sort of tripping the system into a dangerous state. And then that's just additional information. So, in some ways. So we're getting a whole bunch of, we're saying at some threshold, we're saying, okay, well above that, as long as the hydrologic conditions stay above that threshold, then we're in a fairly robust state, or it's not vulnerable. If we fall below a certain level, then we're tripping over these things too often. So that gives us some more information to be able to sort of design our policies around these different thresholds. Maybe we have to do something different if we get into these lower hydrologies. So those are some of the big notions of decision making under deep uncertainty. Reclamation did an excellent job putting together this web-based tool. Here's a nice website for it. CRBP Post 2026 DMDU. And allows any stakeholder, and you guys and whoever else and their mother can go in there and try out their own policies. You don't have to be a modeling expert to do it. It helps to have some knowledge of the Colorado River for sure, but allows people to go in there and kind of test and try out different ideas. And then it runs out, goes and puts it through the full-blown modeling software that Reclamation uses, and then comes back after several hours, says this is how your policy compares to all the other ones that other people have submitted. So in user-friendly interface, try to make it very inclusive, trying to make this transparent. They don't want to be an organization that's sort of everything in a black box and no one can know what they're doing. They're trying very hard to be transparent, using some of the best science available. And this is sort of an initial screening tool that was going on for about the last year, and now we're really moving into sort of the formal, let's choose some alternatives. So this tool has been cranking along, has produced some great engagement in the process. So this is Reclamation's kind of framework. So early stage development of these alternatives. They use this DMDU method to like try a bunch of different options out, find some of these Pareto fronts, develop some possible options, then open it up to stakeholders and say, okay, stakeholders can go into this tool and try their own things, try out some new options, or stakeholders that know the modeling really well can go out and develop their own crazy ideas and submit them to this Reclamation. They're going to take all these things, digest them, put them through these trade-offs, robustness, vulnerability, show what the benefits, pros and cons are of everybody's options out there, and then moves into a much more formal process, which they're in right now. Reclamation-led modeling, where they're really saying, okay, these are the alternatives that are on the table. These are the ones we're going to assess for the EIS process. One of these will eventually get chosen, and then those get passed through big resource analyses. So, what's the current status of the negotiations? Right now, today, they're hot. Everybody's freaking out. Reclamation is strongly encouraging the states to come together to a consensus agreement. Alex, Black, come on in.
Has anyone got a black Carrera bike downstairs?
Black
Carrera bike.
No.
Okay, sorry.
Reclamation is trying to knock heads together to say, states, you got to come together to come up with some type of an agreement, or we're going to force something upon you guys. Nobody in the West likes Washington to tell them what to do. We're all got our guns sitting on the side waiting for. So that's not Feds telling the states what to do is not a popular idea. But the upper and lower basin states are so far apart. Upper Basin's been saying we're not going to contribute. They're starting to move a little bit right now. They've each done their own proposals. Reclamation looked at those proposals and said they're so far apart we can't even include these in the process. They may end up needing to include them. That's the hot topic we're talking about right now. But Reclamation has pushed forth with some different alternatives to develop the draft environmental impact statement, and some of the states are very, very opposed to some of the alternatives. They're basically really angry that their alternatives didn't get included in the process. Reclamation is really trying hard to find some solutions in the middle. So, report. This came out January. 5 different alternatives. We're not going to go through details in these things, but there's always a no action alternative if nothing happens. Nobody wants a no action alternative. That's going to be big trouble because it doesn't cut back enough. If we have another drought and have a no action alternative, we're all just toast. Federal authorities, this is what the feds think they can do without any additional congressional input. And then a couple other federal alternatives and a cooperative conservation one, which is a group of NGOs, came up with ideas. But that's really where we're at right now. And won't go any more into into sort of what each of these things say, but 5 alternatives on the table. States are screaming, saying that we need more alternatives in this. We're not happy with this process. Feds are saying we got to figure it out. 2022 or 2026 is coming really quickly, and we need it. But if you guys can come to an agreement, they'll take whatever the 7 states agree to, but the 7 states aren't coming to an agreement yet. So that is all I have. There's your crash course on Colorado River. You forget the Nile. I'll talk about that tomorrow. But it was my only ending slide I threw together last minute. So, and we have a little bit of time before we go to the pub. We have plenty of time after the pub. Questions? Thoughts? We'll go with. Okay, Homero, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. No, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Really great to hear all these over 100 years of evaluation. I just have a couple of questions about first about the application of your DMDU, DMDU right here in the Colorado. Has the generation of scenarios mainly concentrated on the hydroclimatic conditions, or have you also assessed or generated scenarios to capture demographics, land, water demand, water withdrawals, these other non-climate?
Good question. Yeah. So the initial setup in that web tool had several different demand projections because, so they had a whole. Basically the story is the Upper Basin says they're going to use a ton more water. Everybody likes to exaggerate how much water they're going to use, and we know that's not realistic. So they did other scenarios that sort of cap the amount of water they use. So they threw a bunch of different demand alternatives in there. Currently, right now, so that was in the exploratory phase. Currently, right now, they're only just looking at the one demand scenario because the Upper Basin really doesn't want anyone to look at anything other than their big build-out scenario. That may change, I heard recently, as of last night. But we'll see what the possible new inputs will be. But right now, they're just varying the hydrology madly, keeping the demand pretty much the same. But it's a really good question because those demand schedules are very political too. Like we don't know exactly what people are going to use, but everybody wants to say they're going to use a lot more in the future, especially Upper Basin. Lower Basin saying no, we're not going to use any more. Next to say we're not going to use any more. The Upper Basin says they're going to use tons more. Okay, next question.
Yeah, great presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating topic. I think when I've researched this topic, I've always been struck by these sort of ridiculousness facts about this region of the world, right? And you can talk about a state or a city like Las Vegas being a city that shouldn't exist, or you look at the Imperial Valley.
I apologize, Las Vegas, if you're watching. So
no, I mean, you could say the same about a lot of the different cities. Los Angeles, Phoenix, spread across all the states. And I think my question is how do you sort of value the opinions or the needs of some of these different stakeholders? Does everybody get an equal seat at the table, and do you think that that's something that's coming to question when it comes to the Bureau of Reclamation that's supposed to be ahead of all of these decisions? When you look at something like the Imperial Valley, or you look at the need of a city to have water, you might value those two things differently. You might say maybe Phoenix doesn't need to expand, or maybe we need to reduce farming operations in the Imperial Valley. So does everyone have sort of the same value that they had, the same seat at the table that they had when these, compacts were made? Has there been discussion about maybe putting less weight on some of the things that we used to put weight on in the past when we were in a different pluvial period, or maybe restructuring the value that we put on this stuff?
Yeah, and those decisions, so the allocations are really to the states, and the states decide how they're going to use that water. In general, there's the shift from ag to M&I, and so within the states, there's lots of transfers going on. Farms selling their water rights to the cities, So that's the biggest transfer that's going on. So a lot of big California farms have said, okay, they'll strike deals with Metropolitan Water District to sell water, or within Colorado transfers. Of course, that has major impacts on the irrigation areas and the communities built around those. Irrigation was obviously how they divided the water to start with. The cities were small at that point in the 20s. And then environmental groups were not at all on the table, and the tribes were not at all on the table. They're major players right now, or at least they sit on the edge of the table, kind of grasping on a little bit. They've got a good perch there, and Reclamation is constantly trying to put them back on the table, making sure they have a position there, or at least the tribes for sure. But NGOs are coming up with some of the big innovative ideas. So the NGOs have fought their way to the table. Tribes they should have had it all along. They just didn't. But ultimately, the federal government doesn't have the right or responsibility to put values on things. It's not like in a lot of countries where they say, okay, we're going to prioritize municipal human uses. That's going to be the top thing. And then golf courses rank way down there. The U.S. doesn't really have that kind of thing. It's sort of, they let the market sort of do that magic. Yeah, so it's evolving. I don't know if you guys have had Dustin Garrick at all. Dustin's not teaching now, so he does a lot of water market stuff. But certainly that's the way that things are going. But of course, that leans on those that have money can buy the water rights, and that's not an equitable solution necessarily at all either. So, biggest fear that Arizona has is California is going to buy up all the water. Colorado says the same thing. The environmental group says, go for it. That keeps the water in the river. Make it go downstream all the way to the bottom. Let those Californians take it off the bottom. They don't have to be totally in conflict, for sure, but things are changing slowly, but not top down. They have to change. Questions?
This might be a pub question.
Okay.
I haven't really been home since the new administration. Would you be able to talk? Or would you ask later? Don't ask.
No, that's okay.
How it's affecting these talks.
We don't know yet. So Trump 1.0, that came in. There was definitely a lot of angst about it, and basically the states said, "Stay out of this. We got this." And fortunately, the 7 states are a good combination of Republican and Democratic states. They didn't want it messing with the U.S.-Mexico stuff at all. We don't know what the new administration is going to bring in. There does seem to be kind of a notion of bringing disruptors. We don't know who the new Bureau of Reclamation chief is going to be. That's going to mean a lot. There's a new Department of Interior person, Burgum, I think. We don't quite know where he's going to stand. He hasn't really been fully briefed on everything in the Colorado River yet. The Biden administration really tried to push everything as far as they possibly could, even kind of getting these alternatives on the table before they walked out the door. And now it's sort of the Trump administration, so they can say, okay, well, if it falls apart, it was the Trump administration's fault that it fell apart. It's just a difficult problem. I'm not going to point fingers at anybody, but we just hope it doesn't get politicized even further than it is for sort of the kind of retribution crap that we've seen come out of D.C. We want to avoid that somehow. But it is a big topic right now. Everybody's sitting back, holding their breath, waiting to see what's Reclamation going to do right now. Are they going to keep the process moving forward? Are they going to be pushed to put in new alternatives? Are they going to be pushed to put in the upper and lower Basin States alternatives, which are completely far from each other anyway? We don't know. Stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering about the timescales of the modelling. So, like, how long into the future is the modelling going for? And also, like, after, I don't know if you know about anything about these current negotiations of how long they're planning. Like, is there an end date for this? And then thinking about the next step as well. I don't know if there's any thought about that.
So we're modeling through 2056, so it's a 30-year time horizon on the modeling right now. Typically, we go out longer than that, but 2056 seems to be kind of the window. I think they're looking at sort of a 30-year agreement, which is similar last time. That's one way. So since a good way to deal with uncertainty is don't commit yourself forever. That the initial compact was sort of in perpetuity, and I think we've learned our lesson now. Don't do something in perpetuity. Check in and have like a plan B if it's lock yourself in too much. End of the negotiation dates. I think by September 2026. They have to develop new operational guidelines, and you have to have them in place by then. So the EIS process is charging full speed right now. They want to try to get a final draft in by the end of the year, and a record of decision throughout next year. But I think the drop dead deadline is I think it's September next year. And there's a lot of work to do between now and then. Most of my life now. Anything else?
The Lake Powell idea about like the whole coordination between the two dams was interesting. I hadn't actually heard much about Lake Powell being removed potentially. Is that something that's under very serious consideration? Would you say, like, what percentage?
Well, I think from a reclamation and from an engineering point of view, they're like, no, it's not going to happen.
Right.
There is a lot of interest. And it makes sense from, certain perspectives. The lower basin would love to see analyses of being able to put the water all the way down, bypass, take all the water out. They want the maximum of flexibility. I don't know if they could ever do that. Some people say, well, so yeah, the challenge is can you get the rest of the water out? They probably wouldn't remove the entire dam. There's some groups that are advocating for that, especially a super cool one if you can go there. So since the reservoirs have dropped down, it's deposited all of this sediment. It's crazy amounts of sediment, and now the river's carving through those things again and creating a bunch of rapids through there. So there's a great group called the Returning Rapids. You can go rafting with them, and they're like, I did a trip with them a couple of years ago, and we were taking photos of the same places during some of the initial expeditions down the river at the same time on the exact same day, the exact same second, to try to see how the landscape changed. But little side note. But now you're going through this kind of bizarre moonscape of sediment that's deposited. Like when you think about like impacts on the Anthropocene, like that's it. Like you can see from space, the sediment is massive there. They would love to see Powell eliminated. Probably not going to happen from my friends at Reclamation. I'm highly skeptical of that one. And we know the hydrology varies a lot. And to get rid of one of those massive reservoirs would be might be a little short-sighted, but maybe the fish would be happy. You'd probably lose all your endangered species, though. Yes.
I just have to ask: is water quality part of the conversations?
Salinity, absolutely. Salinity is. Other constituents, not other components, not necessarily. Salinity is a big deal. They're always trying to do projects to try to remove salinity from things. It definitely gets more and more saline. So one of the minutes to the treaty. So Mexico at one point, 1970 something or other, minute 242. Mexico started saying, "Hey, you're giving us our 1.5, but it's crap quality. We can't even use this." So they took it to the U.S. and said negotiation went on, and eventually they wrote a minute that ties the delivery salinity to the California delivers salinity, and there can only be a difference of so much between the two. And that was a great solution. In a way. So it naturally gets more saline as you go down. It's hard to avoid that. But it really has kept the U.S. and Mexico really working together to try to remove saltiness. But other than that, I'm sure there's plenty of other pollutants to consider, but solution to pollution is pollution. Is it pub 30?
30?
Okay, well, if there's any other questions, I'm happy to stay here and answer them, or we can answer them on the way or answer them there. And you can come back tomorrow if you have any others, because we have a lot of analysis to talk about tomorrow too. Okay.
Thank you.